So after Gabrielle's talk, I took my cue from that, and I changed my title a little bit to crossing out the megafire with the gigafire in the title, because here we are, a little bit ahead of the curve with what we thought was going to happen with fire this year. And I like Randy's introduction. I mean, he did a perfect introduction to this talk, because I think one of the things that in this age of gigafire, and in this age when fire, the lid is really off on the scale that a wildfire can get to in some of these really dry years, and fuel moisture being a big component of that. We really, every opportunity should be taken advantage of whenever possible. And I don't think, as Randy's example showed, I don't think that it's not easy to take the whole team off the field and put a whole nother team back on, like they do in football, for prescribed fire when the opportunities present themselves. And oftentimes those opportunities and the resources that are there present themselves during wildfires. And one of the things I want to push back on, in terms of the language that we use for describing wildfire and the management of wildfire for resource objectives, is this idea that there is a managed type of wildfire. Because I think these words and these categories in our minds matter. And we need one of the real, if we're going to be nimble enough to take advantage of the opportunities to burn, we need to be able to do that during the time when other parts of a wildfire on other parts of the landscape might still be under suppression. And we need to be able to take advantage of any opportunity that presents itself on the landscape, especially in the beginning of the season or on the shoulder seasons, as these fires burn all year long, to make sure that if there is an opportunity for good fire, to take care of the accumulated fuels and leave some forest structure behind, that we can do that. And by talking about managed wildfire as a type, we box ourselves into only being able to manage wildfire when it's that type. And that, in fact, in national fire policy, that's not the case. And the Springs fire is a great example of that, actually, where it wasn't necessarily managed at first it could have been managed as a suppression fire, and they could have kicked over that log and decided that they just wanted to suppress, but for a variety of reasons that I'll outline, they didn't, and they just decided to use pretty proactive tactics, often associated with prescribed fire, for that purpose. And so I will keep going here. Hopefully, there we go. This is a big, hairy slide for a big, hairy problem, but it's at the core of what's going on this year, and the core of why 2019 was so special, and why the Springs fire is an important milestone in our ability, in the progression towards not doing this type of wildfire type of categorization. You can read the link in Global Change Biology that John Batsglue and wrote, but essentially we have kind of these hair dryer type of years now, where not only are you making the 1,000 hours and the typical components of the fuel bed dry, but you're also drying out the 10,000 hours and the 10,000 plus hours. And in fact, it might even be that those definitions change because the climate and the aridity that the low humidities and the heat are bringing are changing the very dynamics of the availability of a fuel throughout the spectrum of the gamut of fuel sizes to be consumed. And when you get to this uniform dryness, you get explosive heat production, you get embers, you get 100% ignition when the ember lands, and you get fire line that doesn't hold unless you defend it with all kinds of aerial resources and lots of people and lots of work. And you also get pyrocue, and smoke inversions. You get the cycle where pyrocumulus and then smoke inversions come in after the pyrocumulus and the rapid growth. And then once the winds ventilate, you get more smoke inversions again. And that's kind of been the hallmark that we've been seeing in the last few years of this heavy fuel load, where not only the thousands are available, but the 10,000s, and especially in places like where there's been fuel mortality. So that's one of the things that I think is helping to scale up what's happening in this age of the gigafire, if you want to use that term, which is not quite sure we want to use that term, but maybe. But the key here is what's been happening and the strength of that hairdryer and whether the fuels are dry, as Randy said. And 2019 was a real opportunity, and especially it was an opportunity on the east side where things are always dry, and where we had some real dips in the vapor pressure deficit down here in the middle of the season, and those dips allowed, and then the subsequent rising of that vapor pressure deficit allowed for fire to happen, but on that rising limb of the fuel availability. And that's one of the reasons why that opportunity was the fact that, you couldn't have planned for this from a prescribed fire perspective, but managing a wildfire because you were in that spot with the fuels was really, I think, the only way to get there with this fire. And it went to, 5,000 acres. You can get these, I've got the link to the climate toolbox stuff, and you can pick any spot and then use and look at any year for that spot in the West with this toolbox. So I think it's a pretty important tool. The other thing about where the Springs fire burned is that it's a really unique spot in the Eastern Sierra Nevada. And this conference, I think, was supposed to focus on the east side. So I tried to emphasize that in this talk. And really, that San Joaquin drainage is a notch through which, well, right now smoke is pouring from the creek fire and all of the fuels that are being consumed there, the really heavy fuels and mortality that are the result of a fairly large scale and consistent mortality all throughout the west side there. And that mortality and those fuels being consumed is turning into smoke. And just like you can't trust air you can't see, this smoke is a nice marker for how transport works up and down the Sierra Nevada, and why the east side is vulnerable in particular to the consumption of fuels and production of smoke on the west side. This is from a few days ago where the creek fire was pushing that through. And then the other thing about that notch in the Sierra Nevada is it's a notch through which moisture from the incoming storms comes through and creates a Jeffrey pine forest in the middle of the desert just to the south of Mono Lake. And that Jeffrey pine stand was the object of the protection and the opportunity that they took for the 2019 Springs fire. And one of the dangers of that notch is that there's always wind coming through it. Sometimes it's got moisture in it, sometimes it's got smoke in it, but it's always there, and it's physically driven by the canyon itself, and it comes through that notch right there at Crestview. And I think one of the reasons why Crestview burns so hot is because the winds there are so strong and so consistent. And it comes at this patch of Jeffrey pine, and if there's some sort of ignition at the wrong time and those winds are really strong, that could really bring a pretty high severity fire all the way out to the east extent of that Jeffrey pine stand. And so when this ignition happened, they were really excited because there is a nice, consistent but not too strong southwesterly against which they could back that fire. And they took the opportunity, as long as that wind was there, to keep backing that fire all the way through to the extent to which the FS Pro fire sizes said was probably the average size. So the average size of a fire there was about 5,000 acres. That's about how much they burned. So they modeled it, but instead of waiting for some wind event to take it there, they managed it, and it's spread to that extent. And so, in this case, this wildfire was managed almost exclusively for resource objectives, but that's kind of that's a rarity in this day and age. And I think the idea that we want to make sure that we don't box ourselves in by talking about that. We should really try to talk about when and where the opportunities for that resource benefit exists on a wildfire, rather than just the wildfire itself being for resource objectives. Anyway, and so I was invited to come as an air resource advisor for this, and so I had a unique opportunity because of the resource objectives on this fire to really be part of operations, not just part of the advisory, the PIO shop essentially, and the liaison with the air district. I was actually not just doing that role, but I was actually helping them with the planning of this and figuring out how many acres per day under even relatively unfavorable dispersion and no burn days that the atmosphere could handle, and still the air quality. And so this is an example of the stuff that I would send to the air district to let them know what was happening and manage expectations, and also was the basis for my ability to say to gauge and model and forecast for what the likely smoke concentrations would have been at the most sensitive areas, like Lee Vining and like Crowley Lake and the Mammoth area. So we tracked these emissions, and we looked at what those emissions at that level were doing for the different sites. And I'm sorry, I don't have a map of that ready for this one, but you know, as Ashley mentioned, you know, fuel loading is they were out there doing the fuel loading, and I was very happy to have them there because the typical FCCS fuel beds really had the fuels wrong for this area, and they were much heavier than in those fuel beds than they were actually on the ground. And I think if you don't interrogate those fuel beds and understand what that means for emissions and then for concentrations, you might overestimate what a fire is likely to do in terms of smoke, and then as a result maybe not do that proactive management that otherwise is possible. And what we found was that we were able to manage at 10, 20 tons per day the fuels emissions and push that fire against the wind, and still take advantage of the high mixing heights that are there in the desert, and really still get good fire effects. And when it looked like those winds were going to shut down for a little bit, we actually, you know, paused firing. Didn't stop the fire, didn't suppress the fire, didn't mop anything up, but just stopped firing, and that made the emissions go down for a little bit. And we were able to protect air quality as a result for that period. We got a little bit of moderate there at Benton Springs, which was directly downwind of the plume, but otherwise protected air quality. And I think that's one of the things that if you have an air resource advisor on a team, when there are resource objectives in play, and when the Air Resources Board, you know, kind of considers the fire to be akin to a prescribed fire, you can alleviate those concerns. You can give them the information they need. You can maintain accountability and realistic expectations for the fire, but also still continue with the acres and then ramp the acres back up when the burn window and the capacity for the atmosphere to disperse smoke again resumes, and it did. And we had the opportunity later in the fire to get a lot more acres done. And this is whoops. So that's, you know, the daily PM 2.5 and the daily acres really ramped up after that firing pause, and we were able to get a lot of those acres done, you know, and get it up to the 3,000, from the 2,000 to the 3,000 acre level. And part of our ability to do that was to be able to make sure we manage those expectations in the communities. And we used forecasting models. We used the CANSAC model. It's a critical piece of our ability to forecast not only for smoke, but also just for winds and safety, because it's got that high resolution, almost Wind Ninja-like capability to understand what the topography is doing to the synoptic winds and translate that to what's happening on the ground. And this is just an illustration of how we were getting those southwest winds here for the 10th, And then for the 11th, we saw how the model was really having those northeast winds come in, and we're going to want to push that smoke in and kind of hold it into the Mono Basin. And so we waited till after that was going to go away again, and those winds would resume with their westerly component on the 12th, and that's what was the basis for our firing event. And we saw this 72 hours in advance, and we were able to nimbly kind of adjust to that situation, and just keep going. And so in the modeling, there's a light level of smoke that often is there, and people kind of go, oh, well, there's smoke going there. Well, it's not really that much smoke. It's more of a smoke and haze, and I use that phrase a lot in my smoke outlooks. And a key to understanding that and making sure that was, that gelled with reality were those fuel loads that Ashley and Hugh and that team provided me. And I think going forward, one of the reasons I work at the remote sensing lab now, even though I do my business has a lot to do with smoke, is that fuels and their interaction with the atmosphere and fire behavior really begin and are mediated through the fuel beds, and even the climate and its our ability to affect fire behavior appears to be mediated through the fuel beds and how the drying is progressing over the course of the year and through the gamut of fuel size classes. And so, I think one of the things to think about as we try to be more nimble and get more pace and scale with the good fire on the ground is that smoke management and air resource advisor component needs to be there and readily called for during the management of wildfires for resource objectives, because it gives the ability of the incident management team to integrate what they know about fire behavior with what's on the ground in the monitoring, talk to the air districts, manage expectations, both at the air districts level, but also for the public, and boil all that down into messaging. And there's a template for that messaging now, as you guys are probably well aware of these days, with that one pager. And that's the basis that for the air district to manage the public's expectation more in a very precise way in different communities that they're familiar with and that they communicate with on a regular basis, but also manage the expectations for the team too, and potentially provide that means for interacting with operations and modifying operations such that you can get resource objectives done and still not create crazy smoke impacts. And when was the last time we saw a smoke outlook like this for the east side, right? That's not what they look like right now for the Mammoth and East Side area with the creek fire going on. But really the key to living with fire and the smoke that it's producing, and really the difference between fire for resource objectives and the crazy large-scale wildfires that we have now, is that the emissions are less on a daily basis, and there's usually a period where you get a break in the diurnal pattern of smoke, and the air resource advisors are able to key in on those patterns and give those patterns out through this messaging framework, and make sure that the air districts and the PIOs are talking about that pattern, so people have a little bit of a better idea of what's coming at them for a given day, and they can plan their runs and their lives can continue instead of just being told to shelter in place and stay out of the smoke, which is basically what happens during these larger scale events. And so, we managed this entire fire with only 2 moderate days, and we got 5,000 acres done. And granted, the fuel loads are light, but this was over the course of many days that were not burn days, and we still protected air quality, and we got the buy-in and worked shoulder to shoulder with the air district instead of being on kind of opposing sides and playing that regulated person sort of game. And so I think that's really a model for how to proceed forward. And this is just an illustration from our 2017 paper talking about how, the interest of the air districts in terms of creating patches on the ground that are going to slow down subsequent fires, and the interests of us as land managers are really aligned for this reason. We want those larger patches on the ground. We need those larger patches on the ground to slow down fire, and to leave forest behind. And when resources are drawn down for that forest structure to still be there to slow a fire down, even if there's no firefighters or air resources to slow that fire down for you. And those emissions from that resource objective type fire behavior, when there's an opportunity, where and when there's that opportunity, those are really trivial compared to what you get during megafire. And I can, the daily emissions from the creek fire probably average more than this. It's pretty episodic, but we're getting tens of thousands of acres coming off these fires when they're first breaking, on a daily basis. And so it's several orders of magnitude from what you'd see from the growth of a fire when there's the opportunity for resource objective management. That nuance isn't really a nuance, but it's not something well understood by the public, and I think it's something that we can get out there as a way of talking about how to get ahead of these fires and avoid the smoke inversions, the state scale smoke inversions that you get when you get to gigafire scales and tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of tons of fine particles going in the air all in one day, which is actually what happened on the 8th and 9th of September. So here's a graph that should interest you. This hatch mark thing is the rest of California's emission inventory, steadily decreasing over the years. Whoops. As the Air Resources Board has done all kinds of crazy, great things to really improve air quality in our state. And then on top of that is all the fires under 50,000 acres. 50,000 acres used to be kind of, a boundary between large typical fire or denote a really large fire. And then all the fires above 50,000 are sort of named and called out here for all the years. And you'll note that hundreds of thousands of tons of PM 2.5 are the scale that you're looking at when you're talking about the annual budgets for wildfire smoke, and really the annual budget for the rest of the state's PM 2.5 inventory. And then what we found on the 8th and 9th of September was basically that we reached that 300,000 level in just 2 days. So all of the fires in 2017 or 2018, we put that much smoke in the air in probably 1 or 2 or maybe 3 days, instead of over the course of the entire year. So we really have stepped up in scale, and something different has happened. And it's likely, it's likely about this dryness, the fuels, and the availability of way more fuel now, and that fuel and that heat interacting with the atmosphere and really resulting in much larger scale fire growth. So, and you can get to this inventory. You can't get to this graphic, but I've integrated this inventory with carbs inventory for fuels and emissions. And really what that story that tells is that, the next frontier for air quality really is wildfire, and trying to manage wildfire in a way that doesn't result in an annual amount of emission over the course of a couple days. And as you can see in the last few years, any way you slice it, basically California has been doing way better of late in terms of the amount of particles, all up until the wildfires start. And then once the wildfires start, you're back to where you were 20 years ago, maybe, or 15 years ago. And we're losing ground in the air quality world because of that. So our interests in terms of taking care of this landscape and slowing fire down and reducing those daily emissions and the intensity of the impacts resulting from those daily emissions, I think really do align. And it's not even anymore, it's becoming more and more evident. Here's that same cumulative graph for Bishop, which had its worst year ever in terms of very unhealthy, several hours, several days, very unhealthy versus during the Ferguson fire and the Lyons fire. And Mammoth is just getting hammered right now, of course. Worst air quality that they've ever seen. Some of the data was from a portable monitor before, so it's not all on this graph. But on the east side especially, they are in the crosshairs of all the west side fuel that large scale fire can produce. And the danger here is that, you know, we're going to get some smoky summers, you know, for the next decade until all those west side fires burn off. And if those west side fires burn everything off and don't leave forest structure, and it's just a chaparral field, then that's going to be the norm going forward. So in terms of protecting air quality on the east side, it's really about preserving that forest structure. And if we're ever going to have, you know, some clean east side summers, again, with just light smoke and haze, as opposed to very unhealthy and everything funneling through the San Joaquin and pushing out across up and down the east side, then we want to get at that and find a way to bring forest structure back to these places that are otherwise going to be chaparral fields. So I don't know what that. So I really think that, you know, this smoke management and fire management needs to consider the wildfire alternative too, not just what's going to happen if you don't burn. Yeah, the air stays clean, but if you don't burn, actually the air ends up getting way dirtier because you've basically chosen some larger scale fire to take care of that fuel for you, rather than something proactive and smaller scale, with the daily emissions and intensities that come from it. And a good example of this is during the Lyons fire and the Ferguson fire. You know, a lot of the these are 24-hour averages over the course of a month or so. And we just did a paper and published this. And you know, Lyons was managed for resource objectives. While it was appropriate, it got away from them during a kind of an unlikely east wind event, and then got larger. And there were some local impacts during that period when it was growing fast. But after it subsided and the normal regime came back and they managed it in a confined, contained strategy, it really wasn't having nearly the impact that the rest of the fires, the Ferguson and the Carr and the Mendocino fire, were happening. And so, and you can see those proportions in each day's total PM2 or 24-hour average PM2.5 there. And we were able to use a satellite platform to apportion the actual impacts measured at the monitors to the individual fires. And really, we found that if you took away the rest of those large scale fires and just left the Lyons fire, which did do, I forget the final size, but it's a substantial footprint and a good footprint, as you know right now, and I'll show that figure next. But that
Lee, we're
the cost of that footprint.
Lee, we're gonna have to wrap up
this
pretty
last
soon.
slide.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so the cost of that footprint was localized impacts right around it, and then some impacts farther downstream, but not many. And I won't read all this slide to you, but really, what we're talking about is the price of these footprints is cheap in terms of air quality, and in subsequent fires like the Creek fire that we have right now, that Lyons fire footprint slowed it down and allowed them to use resources on other parts of that fire and save houses and lives. And we have the tools to implement fire for resource objectives on a lot of fires, not just on fires that are exclusively for resource objectives, and potentially we should because of all that. So that's all I have, and I'll leave you with that.